Before we begin, take a moment to support the channel. Subscribe and like the video. It really helps us share real history and bring important stories like this to more people. France and the Road to War. Fear, Memory, and False Security, 1918 to 1939. France entered the 20th century marked by victory and trauma. The end of World War I had placed the country among the victors, yet the cost of that victory was staggering. Millions of French soldiers had been killed or wounded, entire regions were devastated, and a deep psychological scar shaped an entire generation. The memory of trench warfare, mass death, and national exhaustion became a defining force in French political and military thinking during the interwar years. In the decades following 1918, France was determined to prevent another catastrophe. Security became the central obsession of the state. The Treaty of Versailles was seen not merely as punishment for Germany, but as a protective barrier meant to guarantee French survival. However, this sense of security was fragile and increasingly dependent on static assumptions about the future of warfare. Politically, France struggled to find stability. The Third Republic was characterized by frequent changes of government, ideological divisions, and short-lived coalitions. While democratic institutions remained intact, decision-making was slow and often paralyzed by internal conflict. Long-term strategic planning, particularly in military affairs, suffered as a result. Economically, France faced the challenges of reconstruction, global economic instability, and social unrest. Although industrial capacity recovered during the 1920s, the Great Depression of the 1930s intensified unemployment and political radicalization. Extremist movements gained influence, further polarizing society and weakening national cohesion. At the same time, the international situation in Europe steadily deteriorated. Germany, under Adolf Hitler, openly rejected the post-war order. The remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936 represented a direct violation of the Versailles Treaty, yet France did not respond militarily. This moment proved decisive. French leaders possessed the military capacity to intervene, but political hesitation and fear of escalation prevailed. The policy of appeasement emerged not from weakness alone, but from collective trauma. French society feared war more than diplomatic humiliation. Alongside Britain, France chose negotiation and compromise in the hope of preserving peace. The annexation of Austria, followed by the dismantling of Czechoslovakia, reinforced the illusion that concessions could satisfy German ambitions. Military doctrine reflected these fears. French planners prepared for a defensive war designed to minimize casualties. The construction of the Maginot Line symbolized this mindset. Stretching along the eastern border, it was an engineering marvel intended to stop any direct German attack. Yet it also embodied a dangerous assumption that future war would resemble the last. By 1939, France appeared strong on paper. It possessed a large army, modern equipment, and formal alliances. But beneath the surface, the country was strategically rigid, politically divided, and psychologically unprepared for a new kind of conflict. When war finally arrived, France was not ready for its reality. The summer of 1940 marked one of the most dramatic and traumatic chapters in French history. After months of tense anticipation following the declaration of war in September 1939, the French army faced the full weight of Germany's military might. Despite France's numerical strength and fortifications, the German Wehrmacht executed an unprecedented campaign of speed and maneuver, demonstrating the power of blitzkrieg tactics. On May 10, 1940, German forces launched a decisive offensive through the Ardennes, a region that French commanders had considered impassable for large armored formations. This gamble paid off. The German army bypassed the heavily fortified Maginot Line, cutting through weakly defended areas, and quickly encircled French and British units. The Allies were unprepared for such rapid mobility, and their defensive doctrine proved catastrophically inadequate. Within days, the French command structure became paralyzed. Communication failures, outdated plans, and poor coordination amplified the chaos. Troops retreated in disorder, abandoning positions and leaving key cities vulnerable. By the end of May, German units had reached the English Channel, trapping the British Expeditionary Force and many French divisions in northern France. The collapse of the French army was both tactical and psychological. Soldiers, officers, and civilians alike were confronted with a sense of helplessness. The image of a nation that had prided itself on military strength and experience being overwhelmed in mere weeks shocked the public consciousness. Paris, once a symbol of civilization and national pride, was declared an open city on June 10, 1940, as German forces advanced without resistance. Amidst the crisis, French political leadership faced impossible choices. The government, led by Premier Paul Reynaud, debated whether to continue fighting from French colonies or seek an armistice. The rapid defeat, coupled with political division and fear of total annihilation, pushed the country toward capitulation. On June 16, 1940, Marshal Philippe Pétain assumed leadership, promising to secure peace and protect the population from further destruction. The armistice was signed on June 22, 1940, in the forest of Compiègne, the same location where Germany had surrendered in 1918. This symbolic choice underscored the psychological dimension of defeat. France, once victorious, was now humbled and occupied. The armistice divided the country into two zones. The north and west fell under direct German military occupation, while the south became the so-called free zone governed by the Vichy regime. The consequences of this division were immediate and profound. The northern zone experienced harsh control, forced labor requisitions, and German administration. The south, while nominally autonomous, operated under a government that increasingly collaborated with the occupiers. French citizens faced new realities: rationing, curfews, censorship, and the constant presence of foreign soldiers in everyday life. Survival became a daily struggle. The psychological impact of defeat extended beyond politics and administration. The French public grappled with humiliation, fear, and uncertainty. Intellectuals, artists, and ordinary citizens alike questioned national identity and the meaning of sovereignty. The collapse revealed that strategic preparations alone could not guarantee survival. Morale, political cohesion, and adaptability were equally vital in modern warfare. Despite the trauma, the seeds of resistance began to emerge. Even in 1940, small networks of soldiers, officials, and civilians sought ways to oppose the occupiers, maintain a sense of dignity, and preserve France's future. These early initiatives, though limited in scope, would later coalesce into a broader national movement that refused to accept defeat as permanent. The fall of France also shifted international perceptions. Britain, isolated and under threat from Germany, faced the grim reality of standing alone against the Axis powers. Yet the story of French defeat was not one of uniform despair. Figures like Charles de Gaulle, stationed in London, refused to accept surrender. De Gaulle's June 18, 1940, appeal to continue the fight marked the beginning of the Free France movement and signaled that the struggle for French sovereignty had only just begun. Key factors in the collapse. Several intertwined factors contributed to France's rapid defeat. 1. Strategic miscalculations. The French High Command underestimated Germany's ability to execute rapid armored warfare and relied too heavily on static defenses. 2. Political division. Frequent government changes and ideological rivalries weakened decision-making and created inconsistent responses to crises. Psychological factors. National trauma from World War I fostered caution, fear, and a preference for negotiation over confrontation. 4. Coordination failures with allies. The Franco-British alliance was not fully integrated. Communication and operational coordination were insufficient to respond to a fast-moving threat. 5. Over-reliance on fortifications. The Maginot Line, while formidable, proved ineffective against a mobile enemy that bypassed it entirely. These factors combined to produce a rapid military, political, and social collapse that left France vulnerable and divided. Consequences for the French population. For civilians, the collapse of the state meant an abrupt shift from normalcy to uncertainty. Refugees flooded the roads in what became known as the Exodus, leaving northern towns for the south. Food, housing, and medical care were scarce. Families were separated, communication was disrupted, and the presence of occupying forces instilled constant fear. Furthermore, the collapse forced moral and political dilemmas. Individuals had to navigate questions of collaboration, survival, and resistance. Choices that would later define reputations, working with the occupiers, hiding Jews, joining clandestine networks, began in this chaotic period. The emergence of Free France. While defeat spread despair, it also sparked determination among a minority unwilling to accept capitulation. Charles de Gaulle, former Undersecretary of War, escaped to London and immediately rallied French forces abroad. His message was clear: France is not finished. The nation can continue to fight. On June 18, 1940, de Gaulle broadcast his appeal, urging French soldiers and civilians alike to resist and maintain the honor of the Republic. This marked the formal beginning of Free France and laid the groundwork for resistance networks that would grow over the coming years. Following France's military defeat in June 1940, the country faced a profound political and social upheaval. The signing of the armistice with Germany divided the nation into two main zones: the northern and western territories under direct German occupation, and the southern zone administered by the newly established Vichy government. This new regime, led by Marshal Philippe Pétain, claimed to protect France's interests and maintain order, yet it increasingly aligned itself with the German occupiers, creating complex moral and political dilemmas for the population. Vichy France portrayed itself as a state of renewal, presenting the regime as a guardian of traditional values and national unity. The motto of the Republic, Liberty, Equality, Fraternity, was replaced with Work, Family, Fatherland, signaling a conservative turn and rejection of Republican ideals. Pétain's government centralized authority, bypassed parliamentary structures, and cultivated an image of paternal leadership. Many French citizens initially accepted the new regime, believing that compliance could mitigate the harshness of occupation and protect the nation from further suffering. The German occupation of the northern zone imposed direct control over political, economic, and social life. German authorities installed administrators, imposed strict censorship, and demanded economic contributions to the Nazi war effort. French industries were reoriented to supply German military needs, while labor requisitions drew thousands of civilians into work projects supporting the occupation. Public services, transportation, and communications fell under constant scrutiny, and German soldiers patrolled urban centers and countryside alike. Collaboration under Vichy took various forms. Some officials argued that cooperation with Germany was pragmatic, necessary to maintain social stability and preserve French sovereignty in limited form. Others actively supported German policies out of ideological affinity or personal ambition. The French police and administrative apparatus participated in rounding up Jews, political dissidents, and members of resistance networks. These actions, initially rationalized as legal duties or protective measures, increasingly involved direct complicity in persecution and deportation. The moral consequences of collaboration were profound. Ordinary citizens faced difficult choices about survival, resistance, or cooperation. Silence or compliance could ensure personal safety, but often came at the cost of ethical compromise. Families were forced to navigate these challenges daily, making decisions that would later carry historical judgment and social repercussions. While collaboration appeared dominant in 1940 to 1941, opposition movements began to emerge, albeit quietly. Early resistance networks formed among military officers, government officials, and civilians unwilling to accept defeat. These groups focused on intelligence gathering, clandestine publishing, and assistance to persecuted populations. Despite limited resources and constant risk, They maintained the idea of a France that had not surrendered entirely to foreign control. The French colonies and overseas territories became important centers for the continuation of the fight. Charles de Gaulle, having escaped to London, organized Free French forces composed of military units loyal to him and administrators committed to maintaining French authority outside occupied Europe. De Gaulle's message emphasized national honor, urging French citizens to resist passively or actively while keeping the vision of a liberated France alive. His leadership became a symbolic counterpoint to the Vichy regime, representing continuity of legitimate government and refusal to accept German dominance. Economically, the occupation and collaboration reshaped daily life. Food shortages became acute as agricultural production was requisitioned for German needs. Prices rose, rationing intensified, and many citizens struggled to obtain basic necessities. Black markets emerged, along with informal networks to distribute resources. Survival often depended on ingenuity, cooperation, and sometimes morally ambiguous choices. These conditions created a climate of tension and uncertainty, fostering both resentment toward occupiers and skepticism about the Vichy government's motives. Education and culture were also impacted. Schools promoted Vichy ideology, emphasizing obedience, patriotism, and traditional social roles. Universities faced restrictions on curriculum, while intellectuals and artists were censored or pressured to align with state policies. Yet underground networks circulated banned literature, political pamphlets, and news from abroad, maintaining a spirit of intellectual resistance and fostering solidarity among dissidents. Internationally, Vichy France navigated a delicate balance. While collaborating with Germany, the government sought to maintain relations with Britain and the United States, attempting to preserve French influence and colonial authority. This balancing act was often contradictory and fragile, leaving the regime vulnerable to internal dissent and external pressure. The struggle for legitimacy between Vichy and Free France became a central political conflict, shaping France's role in the broader Allied strategy. By 1942, cracks in the Vichy facade became apparent. The German occupation of the previously free southern zone eliminated any remaining autonomy. Many citizens, initially cautious or compliant, began to reassess their positions. Resistance networks grew more coordinated, motivated by both moral outrage and the strategic imperative to prepare for eventual liberation. The early years of collaboration had exposed the limits of compliance and the costs of acquiescence, setting the stage for a broader national struggle. The experience of Vichy France demonstrates the complex interplay of survival, ideology, and power during occupation. Collaboration was not merely a political choice, but a social condition that affected millions of lives. At the same time, the seeds of resistance persisted, showing that even in periods of apparent submission, the will to reclaim sovereignty and dignity remained alive. By 1942, the tide of World War II was beginning to shift, and France found itself divided between occupation and exile. Free France, led by General Charles de Gaulle from London, became the symbol of continued French sovereignty. Initially limited in resources, the movement gradually attracted support from colonial forces, exiled military units, and volunteers determined to resist German domination. French territories in Africa and the Middle East served as bases to organize troops, train soldiers, and maintain political continuity outside Europe. De Gaulle emphasized that France must actively participate in its own liberation rather than rely solely on the Allies. Free French forces contributed to major campaigns, including Operation Torch in North Africa, and later fought in Italy and along the Western Front. These military efforts demonstrated that France was not a defeated nation, but an active partner in the Allied strategy, securing its place in the post-war order. At the same time, resistance movements within occupied France became increasingly organized and effective. By 1943, most groups had united under the National Council of the Resistance, coordinating sabotage, intelligence gathering, and propaganda. They disrupted German communications, railways, and supply lines, while underground newspapers kept the population informed and hopeful. Women played crucial roles as couriers, agents, and organizers, ensuring the survival and effectiveness of these networks. The Allied landings in Normandy on June 6, 1944, marked the start of liberation. Resistance fighters supported the invasion through sabotage and intelligence, while Maquis units carried out guerrilla operations across rural and urban areas. In August 1944, Paris was liberated, with Free French and resistance forces entering the capital alongside Allied troops. This moment symbolized not only military victory, but also the restoration of French sovereignty and national pride. Following liberation, the provisional government led by de Gaulle faced the task of rebuilding institutions, restoring law and order, and addressing collaboration. Trials were held against prominent collaborators, while broader debates about justice, accountability, and reconciliation shaped public discourse. Economic and social reconstruction was necessary, as infrastructure, industries, and public services had suffered under occupation and war. Liberation reaffirmed France's national identity. The combined efforts of Free France abroad and the resistance at home demonstrated that the nation had not surrendered morally or politically. These actions preserved the idea of a sovereign France, capable of participating in post-war diplomacy, reconstruction, and the creation of international institutions like the United Nations. By 1945, France had regained its independence, dignity, and position among the victorious powers. The experiences of occupation, resistance, and liberation shaped its post-war policies and collective memory. The narrative of moral courage, active participation, and national resilience became central to France's identity, influencing its political, social, and cultural development for decades to come.